Hi everyone, my name is Mitch Shiffer. I am a junior at Rollins College studying history and classical studies. Today I'm going to be going over my research from last semester in the fall. My research was on the historical myth of Quetzalcoatl and how to read it from a historical perspective. Cut. Hi everyone, my name is Mitchell Shiffer. I am a junior at Rollins College studying history and classical studies. Today I'm going to be presenting my research from last semester in the fall. My research looked at the Mesoamerican myth of Quetzalcoatl and how we're able to read that myth as a way to historically understand it and use it as a way to understand societies better. So what is myth exactly? Unfortunately, there's no single definition that we are able to use for myth. However, what we can say is that it's generally a myriad of symbolisms, parables, self-identification tools that people use. Overall, it is a way that builds societies. We are able to view myth as a way to associate it with a society and better understand it that way. These should not be taken as literal facts. The events in myths did not historically happen. I'll go over a little bit how this is somewhat incorrect, but for the most part, like any source, we should not read it just the text at face value, but rather we should see it as a lesson to better understand these ancient societies and how they may have operated. Overall, myths are also designed in a special way to help cope with human predicaments that everyone might face. They abstractly explain ethics, why we should be good and not bad, social structure, government, gender roles, family units, death, war, disease, so many other things that every human society faces. Myths offer a way to explain these things without contention. People are not usually able to offer their own personal opinions in myth, so what that's said is set in stone pretty much. There are some misconceptions of myth today, however. Our definition of the word myth tends to be vastly incorrect. Using the word myth to describe something simply to be untrue or false is very much incorrect. Instead, it lacks important information. For the most part, yes, these things are not true. The stories that are said did not historically happen, but it's missing so much more than what we actually see it as. So conceptualizing ancient myth through a historical perspective provides a different method for interpreting these ancient societies. So the Nahua myth of Quetzalcoatl shows a unique way of understanding the ancient Mesoamerican culture from a pre-colonial to a post-colonial society. This is the main argument of my paper that I talked about last semester, and I will be presenting it here through sources that I found, images, and various codexes to show how the myth changes. And it's a fundamental outline for many myths throughout history and societies that change along with cultures. It's a very unique way to view a culture by studying their myths, and I hope that this shows how fun and important it is to look at myth from a historical perspective. So when we read myth historically, we have to understand the vital details of societal structure that it provides. Similar to how we interpret other societal functions such as government, gender roles, family units, economic classes, myths fall under the same category of social functions that provide a different way to view culture. As we can see on the right, this is a illustration of Quetzalcoatl in a human dressed up as the god in a celebration or ceremony of some form, processed by a man on the right blowing a conch horn, which is another symbolic symbol of Quetzalcoatl, which I'll go into a little bit. But we can see how the society worshipped this god. He was a very important figure in their life, just as these government structures and other societal functions are as well. However, myths are very unique. You see, they offer a much more general agreed upon consensus where people differ politically, economically, socially, gender roles, men versus women. Myths are generally agreed upon for the most part by everybody in the same culture. So where the rich man and the poor man differ, they do share similarities in their own beliefs. However, it's important to see how things play amongst these various people. And of course, due to the common oral nature of myths, it changes over time, which is another very unique part of myths from a historical perspective. As the society changes, so does the myth. It's a living organism that rides along with the society. So it's a very unique way to pinpoint different changes in society as the myth changes as well. So Quetzalcoatl himself, who is he? He's this feather serpent creation deity. The earliest iteration that we have that is the most generally agreed upon by historians. He ventures down to the underworld to gather the bones of humanity, which he retrieves and brings them to the mortal realm and creates humankind. So obviously he's this very important deity as he created the human race. He created people. Unfortunately, there are no apparent sources that specifically detail Quetzalcoatl in this early iteration, his early impacts on Mesoamerican society, such as these gender roles, these societal functions as I was discussing earlier, but his image changes drastically through time. His importance in society is clear, however. We can see on the left he's dressed in these very fancy garments, these colors. There's lots of symbolic images, such as the snake and the feathers on him there. However, there's unfortunately no specific sources explaining his importance as himself. There's a pantheon of gods that are important to society in early Mesoamerica, but unfortunately Quetzalcoatl does not have any apparent remaining or surviving text or documents describing his specific importance. As I was saying, myth transforms as the society does. It's a living part of a culture. It's a very unique aspect of myth. So sometimes during the pre-colonial Mesoamerican world, the myth of Quetzalcoatl drastically changes. He changes from this mystical deity to this legendary physical ruler who ruled many centuries before the Spanish arrived, and he was exiled from the east, so towards the Atlantic Ocean. And he was prophesied to return the same way that he came. And I think this is where a lot of people are introduced to the myth. This is how I was introduced to the myth a long time ago. Many historians believe that when the Spanish arrived from the Atlantic coast, people in Mesoamerica believed them to be Quetzalcoatl and his pantheon of gods, or rather pantheon of leaders and rulers that ruled alongside of him, and they were there to restore the former glory of the then Aztec Empire as they knew it. However, these sources that claim this are Spanish documents and very heavily influenced by the Europeans. So the specific details need to be taken with a grain of salt. I'm in the boat that this probably did not happen on a large scale as they claim. However, it is somewhat relevant to think that there was some belief that Quetzalcoatl and Cortez shared some similarities, or some people perceived Cortez to be Quetzalcoatl. So when colonialism hits the New World, Catholicism assimilated itself very quickly with Quetzalcoatl. To many, the Spanish saw Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ. Quetzalcoatl was a creator deity, same with Jesus Christ for the most part. They shared similar characteristics, illustrations, and depictions. However, it's important to note that in the documents that I found, the Spanish did not really see Quetzalcoatl as a separate deity from Jesus Christ, but rather another interpretation of Jesus Christ. He was Jesus Christ in the New World. He just needed to be Europeanized now. This is important to note how the preservation and remembrance of Quetzalcoatl is today, as his European counterpart, Jesus Christ, was very quickly assimilated and reimagined into this new world, which made oppression and control over the ideologies of the native people much easier. In a way, it weaponized the myth in the sense that the people who believed it before the Spanish now believe it to be Jesus Christ. And like I was saying before, it changes over time. There's going to be a gradual change as more Spanish begin to colonize and rule over this new world. More people will come to believe that Jesus Christ is Quetzalcoatl, and in turn, many natives will then convert to Christianity, whether they realize it or not. So the long-term influence of colonialism upon myth are quite interesting. We remember these stories as myth, and like I was saying before, sometimes our conception of myth to be something is not true is not entirely correct, but like I was saying, we cannot take these stories as literal fact. But To some people, these were legitimate events. These things did happen, very much similar to Spanish Catholicism. By our definition, Catholicism is a myth. So why today do we not see it as one? It's quite interesting. Myth could be used as a derogatory term in that sense. It's from the European perspective that these documents and sources, for the most part, are preserved and remembered. It's important to realize the bias and influence that these sources have gone through. This is not to say that Quetzalcoatl and his myth and the pantheon of gods would not be remembered today without the Europeans. However, the influence shapes our understanding of the myth and the word myth itself. So it's important to think the long-term implications of colonialism and how they have upon myth. And in this instance, this is a very unique European perspective versus the New World. So it's interesting to see how colonialism plays in the transformation of myth as it goes throughout history. So in a modern setting, Quetzalcoatl changes drastically. This is one of my favorite images that I found during my research project. We can see Quetzalcoatl as a man, almost humanized, very drastically different, dull colors. Symbolism still there somewhat, but I believe those were ladybug wings. But he's very drastically different from the images that I have shown before. This was a very post-colonial document that I found very heavily influenced by the Spanish and the European Catholics. So it's interesting to see how he changes just from the illustrations that I found from the Spanish influence. So he changes and translates into a modern world quite differently from what we have discussed. So many people do not identify with ancient myths today, especially Quetzalcoatl. Some might, but for the most part, many people do not still believe in these mystical deities or identify with their customs today. So a majority of sources, like I was talking about, have been influenced by Europeans. So how does this play into the modern setting? Is he akin to a European in this picture? Does he look like Christ somewhat? It's important to know the intentions of the documents that we read before we analyze them and before we put them into writing. One of the things I found was that even in the 1800s, people were viewing Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ. The Church of Latter-day Saints in Mesoamerica do see Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ in this 19th century. There are some documents that support this as well. So it's important to see how colonialism has impacted Quetzalcoatl, changing from this mystical deity to this ancient ruler all the way up to actually associating him with Jesus Christ. So in conclusion, myths provide an awful lot more important information about culture, and it's a very unique way to think about an ancient society from other forms of analyzing, such as government, political structures, family units, etc. One thing that's important is that myths are very foundational for pretty much all cultures. Like I was saying, Christianity, by our definition, is a myth, so why don't we see it as one? Christianity is a foundation for many European cultures and continues to be for many people today. This is very much relevant in ancient societies. Many people identified with Quetzalcoatl and his pantheon of gods similarly to how we identify with religions and other forms of worship today. His myth presents a way in which the Nahua people lived. Like I was saying, there's no specific examples from him in this early iteration, but we can see the intense worship, the celebrations, the ceremonies that went in to celebrating this god himself and other gods as well. We can also see how Quetzalcoatl changed as colonization occurred because of the living nature of myth. It changes very well, and it shows the interesting change that happened as colonization got bigger and bigger, and how that translates into the modern day. It also altered the way in which he is remembered in the post-colonial world. As we talked about, many people today don't identify with Quetzalcoatl. However, we can see some people do still think that Quetzalcoatl was nothing more than a European perspective of Jesus Christ. This was just a different way to view it. So it's interesting to see how that myth changes. If you'd like to read more, my paper will be published on the Phi Alpha Theta website. I implore you to read it. It's very interesting. I had a lot of fun. It works a lot with conceptualizing history, the more abstract and theoretical form of history. I had a lot of fun reading it, and I hope that you guys give it a shot. And if you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer. So again, thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to see you all soon. Have a great day and take care.